Welcome back to Stormi Tells Ghost Stories Haunted Savannah on my Girls Rock Productions channel. In this week's video, I will talk about the final haunted square, Columbia Square, and the haunted forts, Fort McAllister and Fort Old Jackson, as well as other haunted battlefields around the city. I will start with the square known for its historic preservation, Columbia Square. James Oglethorpe's plan for the city of Savannah included a street grid, urban gardens, and green spaces. For the most part, city planners stuck with this plan, and Savannah owes a lot of its charm to this layout. The city now has 22 town squares, Columbia Square being one of the most haunted. The area around this particular square was known as Eastern Commons during the 18th and 19th centuries. It was a predominantly Irish neighborhood and was known for its bordello homes and questionable bars. These days, Columbia Square is home to three of Savannah's most haunted houses: the Davenport House, the Kehoe House, and the 1790 Inn. Spirits of Columbia Square included Tabby Cat, an Irish servant named Anna, and even two Kehoe children. Columbia Square is well known for being the birthplace of Savannah's preservation movement. The Davenport House itself was doomed for demolition until 7 local women stepped in during the 1950s and saved the home from being a parking lot, or another square. Savannah Square served as the border to Savannah's Eastern Commons. This neighborhood was mostly Irish and was home to a handful of bars, brothels, and taverns. During the Irish potato famine, Irish immigrants often boarded at the Davenport House, which served as a sort of Ellis Island, a gateway into the settling neighborhood. The area was a melting pot, with sailors, dock workers, and Irish immigrants mingling with African American enslaved people, as well as other servants. One of the most famous ghosts of Savannah is that of a female spirit named Anna. Legend has it that she was a 16-year-old Irish servant who came to work at the 1790s Inn during the 1800s. According to one version, Anna fell in love with a German sailor who promised to marry her when he returned from sea. But like all tragic ghost stories, Anna's beau never returned. On one lonely night, Anna sat upstairs in her room, weeping about the loss of her beau. Anna found herself unable to continue living without him. She crossed the room, and leapt from the window to the street below. There was no chance of survival. Her neck had snapped, and her death was immediate. There are many other stories around the 1790s Inn in Haunted Savannah Week 6. You can also find out about the other haunted houses and inns on Columbia Square in other videos. The Davenport House, which was home to a ghostly Tabby, is talked about in Haunted Savannah Week 1. And the Kehoe House Inn, where 2 children were supposedly found dead in the chimney, is talked about in Haunted Savannah Week 5. Now we are going to go on and move on to the fort that was the site of a Civil War battle, Fort McAllister. Most Americans know just how haunted the city of Savannah is. It was ground zero for battles during the Revolutionary and Civil Wars. It witnessed countless enslaved peoples tortured and is chock full of stories stemming from the tragedies of the past. The Lone Country is one of a kind, oozing in southern spirit and spirits. From the haunted Andrew Lowe House to the entire street of Abercorn, Savannah's city center and surrounding neighborhoods are some of the spookiest in America. Could it be because the entire city is built atop burial grounds? Maybe so. One of the more sinister locations is Fort McAllister, about 30 miles south of the city. Situated along the tranquil Ogeechee River, Fort McAllister was built upon the original plantation of Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Longworth McAllister. Now, McAllister actually perished in the war during a Civil War battle in Virginia. He died in 1864. During the fort's long history, 4 battles were fought there. It was used as a fortification for the Confederate Army. Because of the fort's extremely strategic location along the river, there was always at least one waterway that could be used to bring supplies in and out, and it even made it difficult for opposing forces to enter or leave the city. Location aside, the weapons at Fort McAllister were ahead of their time and truly foreboding. The fort had 10 huge guns, as well as a place for what they called the Red Hot Shot, which was a cannon that shot cannonballs that were so hot they would set wood on fire almost instantly. All the artillery of Fort McAllister was more than enough to defeat any Union ship entering the Ogeechee River. Between the years of 1862 and 1863, the fort warded off 7 attacks by Union forces. The Union kept making the mistake of attempting to storm the fort by sea, and because it had been built with the water attacks in mind, they weren't able to do anything. Eventually, in 1864, the fort finally gave way. On his way across the Peach State, Union General William Tecumseh Sherman found his way to the outskirts of Fort McAllister. His troops were suffering, malnourished, and desperate. Sherman sent cavalry south to the fort and ordered that his men would take the fort with a single sudden attack. With the element of surprise on their side, the army entered Genesis Point, which is a narrow strip of land that didn't allow for much movement, and this caught the Confederate totally off guard. Sherman stood across the way in the Cheves rice field and watched the battle from his hidden seat. The battle only lasted for about 15 minutes. Since the fort was not meant to be attacked from the land and was not built to withstand this type of damage, there was little that the Confederate could do to defend it. Confederate Major George W. Anderson conceded to the Union, and Sherman came in and took over the fort and the city of Savannah. During all the battles seen by the fort, Union and Confederate lost more than just a few hundred men. In the 15-minute battle by land, 71 Confederate soldiers were dead. That's 71 deaths in one single place. Some of the battles were extremely brutal, with muskets in hand-to-hand combat. After the battle, Fort McAllister was then used as a prison for Confederate soldiers who were captured along the coast. It stayed that way, a prison camp, for the rest of the Civil War. One can only imagine how the prisoners were treated there. Prisoners were often used to do the tedious and arduous tasks that Union troops avoided, like digging land for torpedoes. While no recorded casualties came out of the prison, it's no cakewalk for a soul to be locked up there until they die. Over the years, rangers at the fort have reported all types of ghostly happenings in and around the fort. The most disturbing of these involves a park employee who witnessed a headless soldier standing near the fort. The spirit is believed to be that of Major Calley, a Confederate who was killed during the land battle at the fort. He appears mostly by the cannon where he was decapitated, and he is accompanied by an icy cold air. Other mortally wounded soldiers are also seen around the fort, missing arms and legs, while others are covered in bullet holes. In the 1930s, Henry Ford, the one responsible for your great-grandfather's Model T, had the fort repaired and rebuilt since he owned the nearly 5,000-acre plantation nearby. He asked men working on the fort to stay there overnight as he wanted to avoid looting on the job. Those who did stay at the fort complained of disembodied voices, people shouting military commands, the feeling of being watched and followed, and much more. There were even deafening sounds of cannon fire as well as groaning. There even roams a phantom feline at the fort, leveling named Tomcat, following visitors and guests, perhaps just looking for a bit of attention and adoration in the afterlife. Many have seen the cat running through the fort only to disappear when they try to catch up to it. The cat also tends to rub up against legs of unsuspecting visitors before vanishing and leaving the tourists with several unanswered questions. Now, camp mascots were commonplace in the Union and Confederate encampments during the Civil War. Soldiers on both sides of the conflict were known to adopt all kinds of mascots to help relieve the monotonous rigors of camp life. Tomcat was Fort McAllister's cherished mascot. Tomcat was a coal-black cat that was loved and adored by the fort's defenders. It was reported that Tomcat would run back and forth along the fort's defenses during the maelstrom of combat. Each time, Tomcat would wager one of his 9 lives, dodging the wall of lead cannon and musket balls that flew overhead. On March 3rd, 1863, Tomcat's luck had finally run out. In the heat of battle, a stray round found its mark, killing the post's most cherished occupant. Now, I do apologize for ending on such a sad note. As for the Fort McAllister, it operates as part of a public park that closes at dusk. If you're looking for ghost stories, speak to one of the park rangers. Perhaps they'll have a tale or two for you. Fort McAllister has been seen blood, battle, and death before it was turned into a tourist attraction. The spirits of the soldiers who lived and died there remain, showing up in the form of orbs, apparitions, and even just a strange cool breeze in the heat of the Georgia summer. Now, I'm going to talk about another fort whose grounds have been soaked in blood, Old Fort Jackson. Savannah has been front and center to more than just a few wars and battles. The Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, the Civil War, and countless battles with indigenous tribes. These have all left the streets of Savannah soaked with blood. Savannah was established in a well-defended harbor near alligator-infested swamps of the Savannah River. Old Fort Jackson was built as an extra security measure to defend Savannah from attacks from the sea. The fort did a great job, seeing numerous enemies but only failing one time. Fort James Jackson hasn't seen a battle in over 150 years, and it now serves the community as a history museum. The fort may have a new use, but the spirits of the past remain just the same. One of the most active ghosts is that of a man named Private Garrity. He bludgeoned one of his superiors in an attempt to murder him. He then tried to escape and drowned in the process. Sounds kind of clumsy, but Garrity's ghost should not be underestimated. He's known to appear often to tourists and museum staff, scaring the daylights out of them, as he's only ever been seen as half a body. Before Fort James Jackson was built, another British fort stood in its footprint. In 1808, Thomas Jefferson commissioned the construction of a fort at the site as they saw a need to defend Savannah from the possibility of another British attack. The fort was named after James Jackson, a British-born but pro-American politician. He fought for the Americans during the Revolution and then later served as a Georgia state senator. He eventually went on to become the 23rd governor of Georgia. Jackson passed away just a few years after his namesake fort was finished. Construction finished in 1812 just as another war broke out. Just in time, it seems. President Madison was pressured to declare the war while British were out on the seas seizing American ships. Old Fort Jackson held soldiers during the war, and even though it resulted in a draw, the soldiers stationed at the fort successfully defended Savannah once again. Old Fort Jackson was great at defending seaside, but land-based attacks were just too much to handle. General Sherman began his famed march to the sea in late 1864 after he captured Atlanta. Sherman began his advance towards the coast and followed a scorched earth policy, where anything even remotely useful to his enemies was destroyed on sight. His troops burned bridges, stockpiles of food, ammo, and even liberated tens of thousands of enslaved people. Sherman's men then betrayed the free slaves as they crossed Ebenezer Creek. In December of 1864, Sherman and his army finally arrived at the coast. Before they marched into Savannah, they surrounded it, forcing the mayor to surrender. The first order to capture Fort Jackson. The Confederate soldiers at the fort were forced to flee, leaving the fort abandoned. After the Civil War, the fort was barely used. The name was switched in 1884 to Fort Oglethorpe, but was changed back in 1905. The city of Savannah bought the fort in 1924 with the plans to turn the land into a gorgeous public park. The fort was restored in the 1970s and is now a museum open to the public. The museum does Civil War reenactments and daily cannon demonstrations. It was declared a historic landmark in 2000. Before General Sherman captured the fort, a new recruit named Patrick Garrity was charged with guarding the fort's drawbridge. He hated his superior, George Dickerson. No one is sure the reason for his disdain of the lieutenant, but many speculate that Dickerson was anti-Catholic and anti-Irish, mistreating Garrity and his peers for their beliefs. One night, as Dickerson was headed back to the fort, Garrity seized the moment and snuck up behind the lieutenant and hit him in the head with his musket. He broke his skull in 4 places. Dickerson hit the ground and Garrity just kept hitting him until he broke his musket. Nearby soldiers noticed the attack and Garrity dropped his gun, taking off for the Savannah River. He was too tired to swim and ended up being overtaken by the strong current. He drowned. Dickerson survived the attack and woke up minutes later. He ended up stepping down from his post. These days, Private Garrity's ghost roams the fort. He often appears in the same spot that he attacked Dickerson. At first glance, visitors think that his spirit is part of the war reenactment crew, since he is seen in Confederate attire. He's only visible from the waist up, startling those who see him. The reenactment crew has an annual award for Best Actor, and it's called the Garrity Award. It's shaped like the musket Garrity used to kill Dickerson. Every year, something strange seems to happen to the award. Either it goes missing, or it mysteriously ends up broken. The missing award is usually found near where the incident occurred. Many soldiers were stationed at the fort over the decades, and more than just Garrity have stayed behind. American and Confederate soldiers have been seen around the fort guarding the posts they did during their lives. Staff have encountered them up close, claiming to feel a deep dread before they appear. Quite a few of the museum employees have quit on the spot after the ghostly encounters. Tourists report the feeling of being followed and the sound of phantom footsteps right behind them. When walking around the fort, it's easy to become overwhelmed and unsettled. The air itself is heavy, a scar left over from the death and tragedy that the fort endured. If you're looking to visit Old Fort Jackson, it is a museum open to the public, and they do offer history tours. Old Fort Jackson is the oldest standing brick structure in the entire state of Georgia and is one of the 8 forts built in the country as part of the Second System fortification that was done just before the War of 1812. If you're into war history and ghosts, Old Fort Jackson is your answer. Now I'm going to talk about a few more famous battlefields and haunted squares around Savannah. One of the most common questions is, why is Savannah so haunted? After all, Savannah has been given the name the most haunted city in America. There must be good reasons behind all these ghosts, right? While there are a lot of hidden cemeteries and burial grounds of Savannah, it's certainly not the cause for all of the ghosts people see. The battles and wars fought on Savannah soil also contribute to some of the stories. Known as the second bloodiest battle of the American Revolutionary War, the Siege of Savannah was fought right in the middle of the heart of Savannah. Most people associate the Revolutionary War with Boston, Lexington, and other northern locations, so very few people know about this horrific battle. In October of 1779, the French and colonial soldiers tried to retake the city of Savannah. The attack was repulsed by the British. During the course of the fighting, the French and colonists took almost 1,000 casualties. The British had about 150. You can tour part of the preserved battlefield at the Spring Hill Redoubt. Even though Spring Hill is where the bulk of the attack took place, there has been evidence uncovered as far away as Madison Square that suggests that fighting took place there as well. Of course, Madison Square is also thought to be the location of a mass grave of casualties from the Battle of Savannah. Ghosts and paranormal experiences are occasionally reported from the people in Madison Square. Shadow people, visible orbs of light, and more have all been seen there. Of course, the Sorrel Weed House is also on Madison Square, one of the famous haunted homes in Savannah. Another bit of information involves Calhoun Square. There is some evidence to suggest that without certainty that the area of Calhoun Square was a location of a skirmish between the French and British during that October in 1779. French troops were digging trenches in that area in order to get closer to the British lines. While this is not a positive event, there seems to be a good deal of information and reports that suggest it's true. I talked about all three of these locations in more detail in Haunted Savannah Week 7. It is well known that in 1864, General William Tecumseh Sherman made his way to Savannah on his famous March to the Sea. On the outskirts of Savannah, including Fort McAllister, there was a fair amount of fighting in the capture of Savannah by the Union Army. However, once capture was inevitable, the influential men of Savannah decided to surrender the city instead of fight and have the city destroyed. Fighting in the city was almost non-existent. So, while there are numerous ghosts in Savannah that are associated with the Civil War, none of them are as a result of fighting within the city. Ghosts seem to be a common occurrence on battlefields. One battlefield that is famously haunted is Gettysburg. Gettysburg is certainly right up there with Savannah when it comes to ghosts and hauntings. This is a trend that can't be ignored when trying to explain the number of ghosts, spirits, and hauntings in Savannah. It might not be a coincidence that Madison Square is considered one of the more paranormally active places in the town. In week 7 of Haunted Savannah, we talked about William Jasper's statue in Madison Square. One of the spirits most frequently spotted in the square is that of William Jasper, who was killed during the siege of Savannah. Jasper was a sergeant for the 2nd South Carolina Regiment, who made a name for himself in the defense of Fort Moultrie during this Battle of Sullivan's Island, which is also known as the First Siege of Charleston, on June 28, 1776. During the battle, a British warship shot away at the Patriots' flagstaff. Jasper leapt into action and was able to recover the South Carolina flag. Jasper, while under heavy fire, proudly rose the flag over the fort, inspiring the men to rally against the British. For his bravery, Governor John Rutledge bestowed his sword to William Jasper. The victory in Jasper's courageous act quickly became a symbol for the cause. A few years later, as the war continued on, Sergeant William Jasper and the 2nd South Carolina Regiment were called upon for the siege of Savannah, which was led by General Benjamin Lincoln. Unfortunately, this time around, things didn't quite go the Americans' way. William Jasper was killed during the battle against the British forces, but he was not forgotten in death. All across the country, there are counties and towns named after him. Though for all the tributes to Jasper, only the monument in Madison Square can claim to have actually hosted the war hero. The spirit of William Jasper has been spotted countless times roaming Madison Square, most likely readying himself to fight the Redcoats once more. Monterey Square was laid in the year of 1847 to commemorate the Mexican-American War's Battle of Monterey that occurred just a year earlier. But while the square is named in honor of the battle in which General Zachary Taylor captured the city of Monterey, in the heart of the square stands the Casimir Pulaski Monument. The square was built near the site of the Siege of Savannah, a battle that claimed the life of Casimir Pulaski. While Pulaski may not sound as colonial American as William Jasper, who was actually born in Germany and Americanized his name, Pulaski was a true patriot. From a young age, Pulaski believed in the right to freedom and became involved in the growing revolution in Poland against Russia. In fact, he was one of the founders of the Bar of Confederation, whose association was called with the mission of defending the independence of Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Unsuccessful in this endeavor, Pulaski was forced to leave his homeland as an exile. Influenced by Benjamin Franklin, Pulaski decided to immigrate to America. Pulaski believed in the possibilities of America and the freedom of tyranny, and thus joined the cause. He quickly gained the reputation for his bravery and was even noted for saving the life of General George Washington. Pulaski rose through the ranks to become a brigadier general and led his own legion of men. During the siege of Savannah, Pulaski was shot while rallying a charge as others retreated. His wound was so grave that most men would have died instantly, but Pulaski was able to hold on for 2 more days before succumbing to his injuries. In his death, Pulaski's reputation only grew in the eyes of American patriots. And while they lost a particular battle, Pulaski's spirit lived on, helping to rally the Continental Army to victory from the British. Pulaski's burial site became a mystery, as no one knew what exactly happened to his remains. Some said that he was buried at sea, while others insisted that he was buried just outside of Savannah. The truth would not be discovered until 1996, over 200 years after his death. The Italian marble-carved Pulaski Monument in Monterey Square was in desperate need of repair, with cracks and stains tarnishing its purpose. So, the city of Savannah began the process of having the monument renovated in the mid-1990s. During the process of disassembling the monument for proper restoration, there was an incredible discovery. In the base of the monument, a small box was found. Inside the box were human remains. Speculation began to grow. Were these the remains of Pulaski? Well, DNA testing was consistent with the age of Pulaski, and the inflicted injuries matched the historical records. In 2005, the remains were reinterred, this time with military honors. Like many of the squares in Savannah, Monterey Square is known for its ghostly activity. Even before DNA evidence connected Pulaski to the square, there were legends of his ghost down in Monterey. Common reports of people talk of ghostly encounters with a man dressed in Revolutionary-era garb. Only, they almost always disregard him as a reenactor, based on his accent. But, upon giving him a second glance, they are startled as he seemingly disappears into thin air. A square in Savannah is just not complete without a monument of an American Revolutionary War hero. And at Johnson Square, the first established square in Savannah, the patriot who is honored is Nathaniel Greene, a man who was only second in command to General George Washington. The square, which is named after Robert Johnson, the colonial governor of South Carolina, is home to more than just a monument of Nathaniel Greene. You see, his body also lies under its grounds. Greene died in the year 1786 and was buried in Savannah's Colonial Park Cemetery. Decades later, while under the Union's occupation during the Civil War, Union soldiers would desecrate the city's cemeteries to the extent that many of Savannah's departed sons and daughters were lost forever. Greene and his son, George Washington Greene, who was also buried alongside him, were not impervious to these acts of vandalism. In the center of Johnson Square, a consolatory monument was built to Greene in 1825, the cornerstone of which was laid by fellow war hero of the Revolutionary War, Marquis de Lafayette. Once Greene's remains were rediscovered, and his sons were too, they were relocated to Johnson Square, arriving on November 14, 1902. Greene lived his life by a certain code. Having resolved his Quaker faith was his righteous patriotism. However, it is believed that all of this unrest in the afterlife has left the spirit of Nathaniel Greene bitter, not just for his own disturbance, but also for his sons. As a result, Greene's ghost protects their burial site with a fearsomeness that only that he only had previously shown when facing the British. It is said that anyone who visits Nathaniel Green's monument in the shadows of the night may just be in for a fright when the wary soul of Green emerges. That concludes this week's video on Stormi Tells Ghost Stories Haunted Savannah. I hope you enjoyed hearing the stories about Columbia Square, Fort McAllister, Old Fort Jackson, and the other battlefields and squares around town. Remember to like the video and subscribe to my Girls Rock Productions channel for more. While you are here, feel free to check out some of my other playlists. I have started back up my live streams on Stormi Teaches Music playlist. I did change the times as I have a conflict with my job, so they are now Mondays and Wednesdays at 11 p.m. Eastern Time. The live covers are on Mondays, and I teach the song I covered live on Wednesdays. I also will be introducing my new playlist, Stormi Talks True Crime, in just a couple weeks, starting January. Those videos will be posted Thursdays at 6 p.m. Eastern, so tune in for that on January 2nd. If you are ever in the Wilmington, North Carolina area, sign up for the Walking Ghost Tours or Wilmington Spirits Pub Crawl with U.S. Ghost Adventures to have me or one of our other very talented guides tell you some of the darkest stories the Port City has to offer. Also, if you decide during your visit that you want to stay or buy a vacation home in the lovely town on the beach, check out my Moving to Coastal Carolina channel here on YouTube and contact me, as I am a licensed realtor here in southeastern North Carolina. This is the last week to participate in the poll for the first European city I will cover. Vote in the comments for either A. Paris, France, B. Edinburgh, Scotland, C. London, England, or D. Rome, Italy. Tune in next Tuesday at 6 p.m. Eastern for the final video of Stormi Tells Ghost Stories Haunted Savannah. Until then, have a great week, Merry Christmas, and stay safe.